Welcome, everyone. My name is S.Friedman. I'll be the moderator and one of the panelists for this panel, Space Force versus Mars. Ooh. Okay, so we have 4 panelists here. What I'm going to do, I'm going to start most of the people other than the panelists are mute. The format will be each of the panelists will introduce himself. And then we are going to talk for maybe 40 minutes. I'll go through a series of questions. And then the last 10 minutes will be Q&A from the audience. If somebody has a really burning question, they can try to write something on the chat. I'll make sure I'm starting the chat. So you can have say some comment or have any burning questions. Okay, so when I got this panel, the name seems a bit odd because Space Force is something that happened right now in the news, and Mars, or I think militarization of Mars, is something that's going to happen maybe 100 years from now. So the way I chose to approach this panel is do it in a linear way. Start with what's going on right now, and then slowly progress into the future, how it's going to look like in the future, or potentially how we science fiction authors going to think it's going to look in the future. So let's start with the introduction. Jim, would you like to introduce yourself?
I am Jim Sheasby. I'm a professional engineer with an interest in all things related to science fiction, and I'm also a science fiction and alternate history writer.
Okay, thank you, Jim. David?
I am a retired technical writer, trained as a geologist, and I'm writing fantasy and science fiction. And I have a very, relatively good knowledge of history, including what happened with the New World with everybody coming in, which really applies to the New World out there, too.
Okay. J.R.H.
Yeah, call me Jay. It's shorter. I'm a lawyer by day and a science fiction humor author whenever I get the chance in between. These are my 2 babies right there, including the one that I'm doing a launch for at 2 p.m. Mountain here at the convention. So just wanted to get that plug in there right at the get-go. I think it's a really cool subject. I did a presentation a couple of days ago. Some of you, I recognize faces from there, on law in science fiction world building. I think there's a lot of interesting elements there that we can also apply to this specific case. That's the case, maybe.
Okay, and then about myself, what qualifies me to be on this panel? I'm a science fiction writer. I published 18 short stories in different magazines and anthologies. Some of them are military science fiction, and also published a novel, Military SF Alternate History. I'm currently working on a novel that is set in this is a short story collection of mine, Escape Velocity, that takes place in space. Had some military things happens there. The novel is based on the same universe that I'm working on now. Other than that, I'm a blogger with 2.7 million views. I write mostly about space stuff. And other than that, I'm also a former Israeli Air Force intelligence analyst. I have some story maybe that related to at least satellites and things related to space from the Gulf War. I was in the late 80s, early 1990s. So let's begin. And I'll start with again, I'm going to linear, starting current days and then progressively go to the future. How important are NATO's current space assets? How important are space as an arena? I mean, is it as important as land, air, and sea, or maybe even more?
Well, to be the contrarian right now, I'll say that it's not as important as it is what is on as far as the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, and you can see that in that Space Force is quite a bit smaller, and it's just an offshoot of what the Air Force was just recently established in December this year, and really the weaponization of space looks like is what its target will be. So it will probably grow, and then as 100, 200 years from now, if the United States is still around, Trump hasn't run it into the ground, then it will probably then become the more important service. But right now, it definitely is not the most important service to the United States.
Anybody else wants to take a shot at that? Or?
I'd have to agree. We're way at, like, we got at least 100 years before it becomes important, like going to Mars and that. Unless somebody comes up with some sort of miracle fuel, which is highly unlikely, or whatever. So we are not going to have the same mad rush as we did in the Americas of all these settlers coming in.
Jay?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's two separate questions there. The first one is the importance of space itself today, which is obviously immense. Everything goes through in terms of telecommunications, through satellites, in terms of military assets, security, intelligence. Everything goes through space, let alone when you're talking about anti-missile defense, that sort of thing. From a military point of view, obviously space is crucial. So that's one question. But at the same time, I completely agree with Jim and David, Space Force as a U.S. military uniformed branch is as of today, basically very little. It's still what it was before it became quote unquote Space Force, one of the 8 uniform branches, along with the atmospheric corps of officers. It's not necessarily that huge a recognition to become one of those 8, but it's a signal. It's exactly the same as it was under the Air Force with Space Command, doing the exact same things, but it's a signal that they want to develop it into something else and give it its own cultural existence, I suppose. That's probably the biggest interest in terms of communication of Space Force as a creation. You see the budget for next year, supposedly, obviously a lot of things can change in the current environment, but they were planning on having the budget with a lot of redistribution, but dedicated to Space Force, absolutely explode. And then, and it's really all about political communication and I suppose cultural communication and projection at this point.
Yeah. I'm going to take a different approach. I would say that currently today, even if somebody who experienced it a little bit in 1991 in the Gulf War, it is absolutely crucial. And I'll give an example from World War II. Currently, NATO has 3 types of assets in space. We have communication satellites, we have reconnaissance satellites, that's spy satellites, and navigation, GPS, stuff like that. It's crucial for navigation. Just take the aspect of reconnaissance or spy satellites. And let's say in World War II, the Axis powers, like the Nazi Germany and Japan, would have reconnaissance satellites like NATO has today. Really changed the war. The Battle of Midway. Let's say Admiral Yamamoto would have known the location, the exact location of all the American aircraft carriers. Who would have won Midway? If Midway would have won, what would Japan do next? We go, for example, for Canada. Canada was involved a lot on the Battle of the Atlantic. Imagine Germany had an exact location of all the convoys and all the frigates, all of the allies, because it was the allies, not NATO, where they are located. Would the Battle of the Atlantic look any different than what it is now? And if you go to the Eastern Front, if Germany would have known exactly in Stalingrad what General Zhukov was about to do, the pincer attack and from 2 points and encircle the Sixth Army, would have maybe put better forces to try to negate that. And if the Germans would have won Stalingrad, would the war be different? No, I think it is very important. The space assets right now are extremely important for warfare, and they are actually, I would say, maybe even more important right now than, like Navy was very important when the British Empire started, and in World War II, Air Force or aircraft carriers with Navy airplanes were the decisive factor. Right now, space is the new frontier, the new arena, the new place that could actually mean losing and winning wars.
Well, the one thing with that though is the United States does have all those satellites, and all of its enemies also have those satellites. So in the next conflict, the question will be is who will be able to dominate space, which is why I think they're bringing Space Force out and be able to knock those satellites out and then blind your enemy, or in turn, can the enemy blind you by taking out your satellites? So, I mean, that's why the Air Force has, since, there has been weaponization in space since basically the 60s when they put the first things up there. They wondered, was Sputnik able to see into your living room back then? I mean, I realized that they couldn't, but people thought that there was a Russian satellite going over the United States, and this was like the worst thing ever. The difference is that technology and those sort of battles, they haven't really morphed into anything because there's never been a war fought like that. So it's much like aircraft carriers, where at the beginning of the Second World War, they weren't considered to be vital to the conflict until that technology was used in a different way. So Space Force now has the ability to develop those new tactics and what is going to happen into the next conflict, and will they be ready for that next conflict to knock somebody out of space. And I'm sure, Ron, with your experience, you probably saw how, you obviously know how vital those satellites were during the conflicts you were involved with.
Yeah, and right now some countries like China and India and Russia have the ability to knock down satellites from orbit. So there's also a need to defend the assets that are currently in space. Also, yes, to offend, to be able to take the enemy's assets and to defend our own.
Yeah, so aircraft were important in the First World War, but we never think of them as being a decisive factor. And I think, that's where our satellites and stuff are right now, is where aircraft were in World War I. And as we move forward, the importance of all that equipment will just become more and more prevalent as we develop different methodologies. But today, to the United States military, they're not as important. But in the future, I see them, they're growing in importance every year. And as Jay had pointed out, the budget is probably going to increase, hand over hand over the next decade.
Okay, so let's move to the elephant in the room. I think why many people join this panel. What do people think about Trump's Space Force?
I think they need to improve their communications.
Yeah, the Space Force on Netflix. I mean, I didn't realize this was about Trump's Space Force. Like, I thought.
I think they need to improve their communication staff somewhat, because the whole point of Space Force as of today is, one, to make that cultural shift, and two, prepare the ground for those investments later on. And for the battle, if you want to call it that now, for public opinion. I mean, what was it? 3 days ago, they had a tweet that they put out about, imagine that your grandchildren will be asking you about, to show your medals about how the time you changed the strategic, just these absolute ridiculous terms, the strategic landscape. No one's grandchild is ever going to say, Grandpapa, can you please tell me about the time you helped define the strategic landscape? So that's what they need to be doing now, and they're ramping it up massively. But clearly, there's a long way to go, even just in terms of not being ridiculous. Just like the massive snap with their defining their logo and just 100% ripping off Star Trek. It's
Yeah, you noticed that too, huh?
Well, I think everybody noticed it, and they wanted us to talk about it. No bad publicity, fine. But I think it's still a massive, massive mistake. Clearly.
Yes. So in case anybody's wondering what he's talking about, check out the internet there, and you'll see the new logo for Space Force, and it does look very Star Trek-esque.
It's 100% ripped off from Star Trek. There's no, Oh yeah, our star is the polar star, it's Polaris, because no, it's Star Trek. That's stop.
And I'll start just mentioning that Canada is the only country in the world currently that has an astronaut as the commander-in-chief of its armed forces. Talking about Julie Payette, the governor of Canada, the Governor General of Canada. Okay, so going back to Space Force, I think it's essential to have the ability to defend the assets in space and also maybe able to take the enemy's assets from him being able to use it. If it should be a separate branch or part of the Air Force, I don't think it really matters right now. But what is a little bit concerned is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. That treaty initially was put in self to make sure there are no nuclear missiles in orbit that can rain down in 5 minutes. I'm talking about the militarization of space. So I think one of the things that perhaps Trump is trying to do right now is maybe deviate or not entirely keep this treaty in place. What other panelists think about that?
Well, if you've watched any James Bond movie, you already know that there's massive missiles and stuff in space already. So we have no way of enforcing that. We don't know what other countries have launched. So there's no way to know what's up in space if any country has placed those weapons. They just haven't advertised it.
I think you definitely hit it right on the money there, Ron, because currently the Outer Space Treaty and its efforts to stop militarization of space have so far been successful, at least in terms of what we know of. Absolutely, Jim. But it's also the only bit of effective space law that we really have. And it's only between governments. So that's, it's to start attacking that when it's the only bit of actual space law of its own and outside of ad hoc agreements that we have, and that's effective or has been relatively effective up till now, is, I think, immensely important when, and again, this is a subject that we could talk about for hours, but how important it is to actually develop a space law of its own going forwards, be it from a military point of view, and but even from a personal, criminal point of view, a commercial point of view, be it civil or penal, all of that, is sorely lacking now. And the only bit that we kind of do have, which is, the Outer Space Treaty, is under attack, clearly.
David, do you have any?
Yeah, now that I think of it, in World War I, the main reason for developing the fighter plane was to either shoot down observer planes or to defend observer planes. And throughout the entire World War I, the observer plane was the main reason for being in the air. This is much like our spy satellites.
Yeah, so maybe I think I read some Robert Zubin in his book, The Case for Space, was talking about developing fighter satellites, that their job is to fly in space and protect other satellites from being attacked, and maybe attack enemy satellites. So maybe it's kind of a reference to World War I and World War II, when air became an arena. Now space is starting to become an arena. Probably going to be robotic. I don't see people Star Wars style doing it.
Okay,
imagine the maneuvering you can do out in space. Not limited to barrel rolls and loops.
Yeah, you need a lot of propellant. Okay, so we can move a little bit forward in time, maybe 20, 30 years into the future. Let's talk mining in space, private sector. How will mining, right now there are SpaceX and other companies are working to develop a much cheaper way of deploying payload to space. And once it will become cheap enough, then people will figure out that there are a lot of resources or raw materials in space, like gold, platinum, rare earths, mineral, helium-3, water. Water is going to be very important. and company will start to mine these resources. And that's not entirely in conflict with the outer space limit, because private companies, maybe they cannot own a property on the moon, but they can mine resources and take them and sell it. And I can see a situation that maybe there are 2 or 3 companies coming to the same asteroid, and a conflict going to arise. How are the panelists see that some of the conflicts can be resolved?
You're talking about a range war, basically, fighting
Yep.
over
Can you explain?
for money.
So David, you would like to? So I'm talking private company, mining resources, and in conflict arise, do we see private armies? Do we start seeing space marines?
We already see that as the United States and Canada and Western countries expanded their mining operations into South America and third world countries in the Middle East and into Southeast Asia, that the United States tried to project their military might into those areas to protect their assets, whether they be oil or minerals. Primarily it was based around oil. So now as we go into space, I mean, I doubt that oil will be anything that we will be able to find unless we can find a lost civilization on an asteroid somewhere. But if we are, if a country is going to have assets in space, and the company that is mining those assets is going to be paying any sort of tax or any sort of royalty or any sort of rights, so there's an economic incentive, then there will definitely be an economic incentive to protect those. So if company A is making a profit off of mining on the moon, then company B is going to move in. And if company B is with another country, you're now going to have a conflict between those 2 countries. And you're going to have some sort of legal framework to work out those conflicts. And if those conflicts cannot be worked out, and one person starts poaching on somebody else's property, then you could see where this could turn to more forceful means, and that would be violence. And at that point, that's where you can end up with conflicts within space as people wrestle over assets. So if you end up that you go to the moon and you're mining it, and you need access to some sort of asset in order to make your operation work, and somebody else controls that asset and they're being totally unreasonable about it, you can't buy that asset, you can't get that asset, then people will turn to other methods in order to protect their strategic interests. And we see that done time and time again around the world already. So I don't see how it would be any different once we start setting up mining operations on asteroids or the moon. And that would be... And that would be a reason why we would need to have, you would have to have some way of enforcing those interests and staking a claim to those and all that legal framework and how that's going to work. Those are things that are going to have to be hammered out in the future in order to avoid conflicts like I just described.
We got 3 historical models we can use. The model is the Wild West of the United States, when there really wasn't much of an overlying force controlling anything, and that ended up with all the little private armies and claim jumpers and things like that. We can have the Canadian model, where an RCMP, the rocket commuting mobile police, as we may call it, have established themselves, and people going out to mine asteroids suddenly find out they have to fill out all these forms from a space station next to them. Or we can have the South African model, where one person, basically Mr. Rhodes, takes over everything and everybody else agrees with it because he's doing a good job, and we end up with a corporation controlling space.
Yeah, from a legal point of view, those are really interesting.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I think we have 2 legal frameworks. I'm not an expert on law. One is the Outer Space Treaty that prohibit any country from owning part of space. It's not prohibiting private company for mining space, but the country cannot own part of the moon or part of the asteroids, according to the treaty that exists now. And another thing that happened right now on Earth is international water. So I'm not an expert. I don't know, maybe Jay, you know a little bit how resources could be mined in international water. Or
yeah, well, that definitely exists today. I could talk about international maritime law, which I've worked in quite a bit, actually, so I could talk about that for some time. With regard specifically to space, what we see today from a legal point of view is that, one, what exists is insufficient, but that battle is also happening and starting to happen at the international level from a legal point of view. In 2015, if I'm not mistaken, the United States put into place a law already establishing, this will be the legal framework for companies that, are identified as United States companies. We will give them these protections and this entitlement to property over anything they bring back from space, any resource and so on, as long as it's all controlled and registered, regulated. But they put in that framework. Luxembourg is also at a European level positioned to provide that legal framework, and there are quite a few space companies based in Luxembourg to provide. And so you're going to end up, if you talk about maritime law, clearly the way we're headed is that you will have the equivalent of flags of convenience, national regulatory entities that provide less regulations, less framework, less constraints, and that are considered as more advantageous, with lots of downsides as well, just like flags of convenience on Earth massively, particularly from a social point of view. But that's what it's, that's unless internationally entities such as the UN manage to step up and enforce a widely respected space law that's also effective for private entities, which, as you say, is not the case at all today. That does not exist. Then it's going to be a major issue. Clearly, even the ISS, as I was saying, even for private citizens, which are the astronauts, they don't stop being private citizens just because they're up in space. There is no law that is specific to space. There's just these little bubbles of national sovereignty that make absolutely no sense if there's ever a problem.
Okay. So this panel, after all, is about Space Force. Does anyone want to add how, if there is such conflict between companies over resources, how it's going to look like? What weapon will be used? I wrote a little bit about my book, but other people should talk.
I think at the end of the day, it'll depend on what is the value of the resource that they're looking to try and control. So if there's something in space and they can get that resource and there's lots of money to be made from it, then the methodology is going, that economic factor is going to drive the methodology that they need to do. So that's where you're going to see the raising of private armies. So, going back to Dave's, model of the Wild West, where you found a silver mine, and if you had more might, you could go in and you could take that silver. You could basically rob it. You will get those. You will get international thieves who will try and steal those assets, either in transport after they're mined, after they're refined. But more likely, you will get people who will try, from a corporate point of view, to try and control the boards. And then you could get the ultimate, where you have somebody who walks in and says, I'm now in control of this company, and this is the reason why, because I have the might, and nobody can take it away from me. So the rich billionaire who funds a whole bunch of mercenaries to go up somewhere and say, look, we're going to control the space soda industry, and we're gonna be the ones who are going to control everything to do with this particular asset.
Okay, we have a related question from the audience, from Michael Gillette. Fighting over outer space resources will most likely be waged on Earth. Space piracy is most likely far too expensive to be rational for foreseeable future. And there are question marks. So you talk about robbing, so we're talking about space pirates now.
Yeah, but you could take control of those at any point. Like you could do that as you could say they have an automated reentry vehicle. All you have to do is hack into that automated reentry vehicle and redirect it to land in Luxembourg. And then when it lands in Luxembourg, Luxembourg says, well, we're going to protect it because it's here now. And then you've got the ability to take those products and disseminate them throughout your marketplace to make money. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a ship that sails up and pirates swing over on a rope in space and takes it over. I mean, it'll be a more sophisticated way.
Would be cool, though.
But it would be cool. Especially the swinging on ropes, because I'm not exactly sure how that makes sense in space.
More
but
of a tethered yourself with the rope.
Space is all about ropes. Everybody has ropes in space. Everybody's tethered.
And swords.
Swords, maybe not so much.
So anyways, that's one possibility, and there's thousands of other possibilities about how you could steal. It's just amazing when you realize how innovative, when money is up for grabs, how innovative thieves can be at figuring out ways to steal things, and there are a lot of different ways that they can take control of a product.
I mean, space offers one of the most simplest weapons of mass destruction that humankind will ever have available to it, which is kinetics. Just from the moon, any ability to launch a rock big enough down Earth's gravity well is holding the whole Earth hostage. It's amazing. I mean, was it Heinlein wrote very early on about that, and extremely well.
The moon is the harsh mistress.
It certainly is. And there's no such thing as a free lunch. So going into space, there's no such thing as a free lunch. It has consequences, including for Earth having, the moon is an amazing tool and will be a major strategic point in terms of launching towards the rest of the solar system, because it's incredibly easy. Even today, with our current technology, even I think just using Kevlar, we would be able to build a space elevator on the moon to launch at very low cost items from the moon up into and towards the deeper solar system. You don't even have to use that, in my mind. Just like a maglev launch system is so much simpler to, again, just send payloads and also land, to and from the deeper solar system. Obviously, you have to get out of Earth's gravity well to get to the moon, but once you're at the moon, that becomes so much easier. So I think it's going to be massively strategic, and there will be inevitably conflicts, especially, and I'll come back to my wheelhouse there, but especially if we don't have, as is currently the case, any coherent space law, and it is inevitably going to be either the Wild West or, in the best of cases, I love the rocket commuting mobile police. It's a fantastic concept. That's the best of cases we could hope for, I think, currently.
Any more comments? I know that in my book, for example, in Escape Velocity, there was a syndicate that was mining the moon that slowly turned into a pirates corporation. So they were using, for mining, they use nuclear weapons, but like use dynamite in the Wild West, they use nuclear weapon to blow up asteroid, and then it's easier to mine it. They also use industrial lasers, and they use it in battle sometimes. Maybe it will work, industrial laser for drilling, to use it for other purposes.
I don't hear it too often, but the ideal weapon for ship-to-ship combat is a cannonball. Kinetic energy, just send it, which gives you the question that we haven't seen any stray cannonballs flying around Earth from outer space. So maybe if there are any spacefaring creatures, they apparently have decided to be peaceful about it.
Cannonball, yeah, it could. A railgun could work. I know the expense they use railguns.
They don't even have to make it pointed for air resistance. There is no air resistance.
Okay. There was a couple of episodes of The Expanse that recently, I've just seen the first 3 or 4 episodes. They dealt with I guess, a version of space piracy. And they knew that there was a ship coming in to attack them, but it was so small, the space was so big, they really couldn't see until it was really close. And by that time, it was basically too late. They'd already, been hit a couple of times and were boarded and taken over. So there's just the general vastness of space. You're dealing with distances instead of hundreds of miles or hundreds of kilometers, like you do on naval battles here or on land battles. You could be potentially talking about tens of thousands of kilometers of distance, but you're just trying to monitor and protect between just flying between the planets. That's a humongous.
Yeah, and I think if you have a spacecraft capable of maneuvering and somebody fire from a long distance a kinetic weapon, you'll have enough time to move aside. Okay, so maybe it's time to move to the far future, maybe 200-300 years into the future, into science fiction optimistic that we have a colony on Mars, in the space station in the asteroid belt, maybe on some of the moons of Saturn and Jupiter. Jupiter is a bit problematic because of radiation. So we have a space-faring civilization in our solar system. That's in the farther future. Will they break free from Earth or from their country of origin? And how wars will look like, or conflicts will look like 200-300 years into the future?
Well, I think once people set up any sort of permanent residence anywhere, then they, they'll look on it as squatters' rights. They now have the ability that they want to control their own destiny, and you can see that example time and time again as people moved into different parts of North America, for sure. There was 13 colonies they broke off, but even when the Mormons moved into Utah, they had decided that they were going to go out there and set up their own country. And so, I mean, through the historical record, we see that when people start getting somewhere, they want to be able to set up their own governments. And once they do that, and somebody decides, no, you can't set up your own government for whatever reason, then we're going to open it up to more conflict.
Okay, there is a question from the audience, from Michael Gillette. What about space terrorism? For whatever cause, destroying a few satellites and creating junk in orbit could be devastating.
But we're already facing that problem today. Satellites collide, satellites break down. The astronauts have lost a few items from time to time. As time goes by, as we launch more satellites, we're going to end up with more space debris, and at some point, it just might not be possible for us to leave the planet anymore.
Yeah, I think that if I don't really consider what is happening out there to be space terrorism right now, but in the future, if somebody sets up a colony and decides that they're going to be one man's freedom fighters is another man's terrorism. So for whatever the cause will be, yeah, it'll be easy to do disruptive things, and then it becomes just a matter of you would come up with a defensive weapon to when you fired off your rocket, something would go ahead of it, or something would clear out it, or you would have a space elevator that would clear out that space debris. And over time, a lot of that space debris is going to settle back into the upper atmosphere and burn up. It's not going to stay up there forever. Although right now the problem is that the stuff stays up there long enough that it is become a problem.
Yeah, there is some friction. It also depends on the height. If it's less than a few 100 kilometers, and then it's probably not going to be more than a few years. But if it's higher than that, it could be for much, much, much longer. And
the political issues of what we're saying about space settlements and seeking independence, particularly if we're talking about Mars, which is that second half of our title. I think The Expanse, like James says, is an amazing example, both in the book series and the TV series, of how these questions will inevitably come up and what different answers to them may be. I'm going to put on my contrarian hat there for a second and say that there are lots of examples in history and in present day where there have been massive expansion, and yet there hasn't necessarily been a massive push for independence, as long as from a specific national entity, if we're in that national framework, which might not make any more sense. My personal hope is that it won't make that much more sense in the future, but anyway, that's something else. But if we're still in that national framework, even just look at the United States, look at Canada, expanding from lower upper Canada out to Alberta, which is where, we are all in spirit, and BC, BC doesn't necessarily, want or have any interest in being independent currently. It has representation, it has its own obvious impact and control in so much as any other province over its own fate, and then it has its own provincial, so there are lots of different models, and it's not because, historically, between I'm on the East Coast, I'm a maritimer, between where I am and Vancouver Island, it's almost the same as between here and Mount Olympus, Olympus Mons, on Mars, in terms of, at the time, what it represented to get there. In fact, originally it wasn't even possible for people from the East Coast to travel all that way. So I don't think we need to assume that they will immediately want to say, oh, well, Earth can go, whatever itself to remain polite, and that we need to be independent. I think that there are political systems that can be in place that has to be anticipated, and, have, devolved power, to have, this is a political scientist talking, to have representation. The US the issue was economic interests and lack of representation. The Boston Tea Party was, no taxation without representation. There are other models.
Yeah, I'm sure there'll be a lot of models. So right now it's 12:42. We are opening it for Q&A from the audience. So there are two options. One is put something in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question. So anyone from the audience is encouraged to participate now. If not, I'll tell my war story.
Okay, tell your war story.
1991, I was a young, I think sergeant, stationed in northern Israel during the Gulf War. Just before the Gulf War started, or I think the Americans started to bomb Iraq at that time. And suddenly in the middle of the night, I get a phone call. I answer the phone. There was a lady speaking in English, and she was panicking. Israel is under attack. There are missiles flying your ways. Relax, lady. Nothing is going on. And my daughter is in the base. I wonder what's happened to her. Nothing. Trust me, nothing going on. It's quiet. Everybody's asleep. This is Air Force intelligence. We know what's going on. There is no missiles, no nothing. And then the siren starts. So what happened is that the American satellites, it can detect the missiles when they are launched, and it takes them 4.5 minutes to fly from Iraq to Israel. And when the first missile were launched, it took the American 2.5 minutes to get the approval to give the information to Israel. But the CNN knew that, I don't know how, they knew it before that. So that lady saw CNN that there were missile attacks. I don't know, it sounds like a scene maybe from Austin Powers, Dr. Evil, when they saw on Jerry Springer that Dr. Evil was coming back. Yeah, so CNN knew before us that missiles were launched. Later on, the satellites were connected, so we got the 4.5 minutes warning, but the first time, it took 2.5 minutes, and CNN knew before us.
So the question I would have is, did you start watching CNN after that?
I started watching Jerry Springer.
Can I ask you guys a question?
Okay, so please ask questions.
Space Force. given the success Musk is having with private space industry, when can the U.S. government or any government step in and control what they can and cannot do? And when can Musk say, I'll do what I want, and he can do what he wants? Like, how do you balance that?
Well, I think as long as Musk live in the States and his company is registered in the States and all their resources and employees are in the States, they have to do what the government is telling them.
But Musk can move to the Cayman Islands and launch whatever he wants, wherever he wants. So,
yeah. But then he has to take
how
all the
do
info.
you deal with, say, a rogue billionaire with modern technology to do exactly what he wants?
Or Luxembourg.
Yes, Luxembourg. I agree with Michael that that is a great scenario. Somebody should make a movie about a rogue billionaire who is going to launch some stuff into space, because the technology is right there. The personality is actually right there. Everything is right there for it today. That within 4 or 5 years, there could be a complete reversal where you have a corporation is going to establish their control over space, no matter what the United States Space Force thinks that it can or cannot do, as they have the technology and they're able to quickly deploy it and implement it, and then face down space by saying, look, we can launch something from orbit here that'll take out Washington or take out your launch sites in wherever they are in the United States. So yeah, that's a definite scenario that is plausible and could be something we could see in 4 or 5 years.
Okay. We have
Good
morning.
This all reminds me of the mouse that roared.
Okay, we have 3 minutes left, and we have. If I'm done, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that Musk does not. He will not necessarily leave America, just like the Hudson's Bay Company didn't leave England. What he'll do is convince the American government, very easy to do, that it's in their best interests to protect him and his fellow rich friends. That is how wars have happened in the last 1,000 years. No matter what you talk about in history books, we like to say it's political, but it isn't. It's all for money, and it's always been the rich convincing whoever's in charge of the theoretical government, because the rich are the government. It has always been them convincing the government to fight on their behalf. The
East Indian Company.
The British East India versus French East India led to wars all the time, and Hudson's Bay Company owned 1/10 of the world, just like Musk could go out and say he owns 1/10 or all of Mars, 1/10 of the solar system. And what will happen is when somebody from Germany challenges him, the U.S. will squash them by squashing Germany.
Okay. So we have about 2 minutes left. There is one question on the chat, so maybe one person can answer. Why is there so much focus on Mars when we don't have a moon base yet? Won't the lesson learned in living on the moon serve for a safer mission to Mars?
And it wouldn't just serve for the mission, but it would also be, in my mind, the condition to actually have a sustainable colony on Mars or elsewhere, Europa or Ceres, as we saw recently, because it's so much easier, again, to launch payload and cargo in particular, but also even passengers from the moon into the deeper solar system than it is from Earth. So absolutely. And in fact, that's what's in place. That's what is starting, I think, before the moon base missions. The Artemis program is already very much launched.
Thank you, Susan, for hosting this panel. And thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the convention.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everybody, for coming.